The purpose of this video is to give you an introduction to the 3-act film structure. Now, having structure in your film is important. It's a proven method that's worked over time, well before our generation or even the existence of film. And moreover, it's a well-accepted way of modern storytelling. Now, I've probably lost some of you already because you don't want to hear about rules or structure. You want depth or truth in your film. You want the freedom to express yourself artistically. Well, I leave you with this motivation. In the words of Pablo Picasso, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them as an artist. So essentially, give yourself a foundation and then let your intuition take over. Then you can make it your own. So to start out with, we're going to do a brief overview of the 3-act structure. Then we're going to get into each act specifically in great detail. And then finally, we're going to do a movie analysis to the 3-act structure. I highly recommend you're familiar with the truth premise outlined in my other video titled How to Incorporate Truth in Your Film, because the truth premise is an essential part to understanding the 3-act structure. So your film is going to contain 3 parts, a beginning, middle, and end, or an act 1, act 2, act 3. The truth premise fits into the structure quite nicely. For the first half of the movie, the protagonist is going to practice a vice and experience the appropriate behavior traits. Halfway through the movie, they're going to start to practice the virtue, and the behavior traits from the first half of the movie are going to be resolved. This will become more clear in our movie example at the end. Let's get into detail of the acts. Just to be clear, I'm going to break up each act as the first half or the second half. The first half is going to be denoted as A, and the second half is going to be B. This is going to make more sense when I actually get into the structure outline. So let's get into Act 1 or Act 1A. This is the very beginning of the movie. This is the introduction to your film. Here's where we get to see the regular life of your characters. Essentially, you're putting forward the setting of the film. And then we have the midpoint of Act 1, or Act 1A's turning point, which is also called the inciting incident. This is where a new opportunity comes to light. And with that opportunity, there's going to be a physical goal. At this point, it's where you're going to ask your protagonist to take on the goal. Now we're getting into the second half of Act 1, or Act 1B. This is where the protagonist tries to maintain their old way of life and rejects the new opportunity. As a writer, though, you need to put the pressure on your protagonist to try to take on the new opportunity, to accept the new goal. And then finally, we have the end of Act 1, or Act 1B's turning point, the climax of Act 1. This is where the protagonist is going to be forced to accept the new opportunity. And with this new opportunity, there's going to be a very distinct physical goal made clear. And this is going to be the physical goal for the rest of the movie. Then we have the very beginning of Act 2, or Act 2A. The protagonist is going to try to make progress towards the new goal using the vice from the truth premise. And it's not going to go well. They're going to experience some success, but mostly overall, they're going to experience defeat. Then we have the middle of Act 2. Or Act 2A's turning point. This is the choice. Here, a choice is offered to the protagonist. A choice to change the method of achieving the goal. In a good feel movie, they're going to choose virtue. In a bad feel movie, they're going to choose vice. Now, from here on in, we're going to assume a good feel movie, so we're going to stick with virtue. Now, the actual choice being made doesn't need to be obvious. The protagonist doesn't even need to know that they're actually making a choice. However, it would be ideal if the antagonist ends up pressuring the protagonist into making this choice. Now we're on to the second half of Act 2, Act 2B. This is where the protagonist is going to make progress towards the goal using the virtue from the truth premise. However, some setbacks are still going to be experienced because having conflict in your story is always interesting. Now we have the end of Act 2, Act 2B's turning point, the climax of Act 2. This is where the protagonist confronts a major obstacle and is put in a position of the point of no return. Essentially, the protagonist burns all bridges except for the bridge leading towards the goal. The protagonist is committed now. They're committed to the goal and they're committed towards exercising the virtue from the truth premise. And at this point, the world of your film can see the true colors of your protagonist. And now we're on to the end of the movie, Act 3. In the beginning of Act 3 or Act 3A, this is where the danger towards your protagonist is truly ramping up. The protagonist's back is up against the wall. Then we have the midpoint of Act 3 or Act 3A's turning point, the final incident. This is where the protagonist must willingly face their demise for the success of the goal. For the second half of Act 3 or Act 3B, the protagonist is going to fight with all their will. They're going to fight with everything they have towards the goal. And then finally, we have the end of Act 3, Act 3B's turning point, the film's climax. This is where your protagonist either achieves their goal or doesn't achieve their goal, and the antagonist of the movie will experience the opposite. And finally, we have this bit that happens after the climax of the film called the denouement, which is a French word which means to untie. This is where you, the filmmaker, gets to tell the audience what the film was really about. You get to say the truth premise, whether it be through dialogue or through visual storytelling. And now what we're going to do is analyze the film Braveheart with regards to the 3-act structure. Now, of course, I'm assuming you've seen the movie. Otherwise, this whole second half of the video is going to be completely meaningless to you. So I highly recommend you go see it. Watch it. Watch the movie Braveheart. Really good stuff. Mel Gibson. Now, the first place to start with regards to structure analysis is to figure out the film's truth premise. Midway through the film, the truth premise is revealed through the protagonist's dialogue. William Wallace is speaking to a bunch of Scottish nobles, and he says, and I quote, "You are so concerned with squabbling for the scraps from Longshank's table that you've missed your God-given right to something better. There is a difference between us. You think the people of this country exist to provide you with position. I think your position exists to provide these people with freedom, and I go to make sure they have it." Now, interpreting this dialogue and in the movie its entirety, you can start to see that the truth premise is about freedom, liberty, and not being ruled by an oppressive government. So Braveheart's truth premise could be compromise of liberty leads to tyranny, but dying for liberty leads to freedom. Also from the dialogue, we can start to see William Wallace's, the protagonist's, main goal, which is to claim Scotland's freedom from the English. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Now that we have the truth premise, let's work through the 3-act structure of the movie. Act 1, or the very beginning of Act 1, Act 1A, as a reminder, this is where the setting of the movie is set. Here we see the Scottish people being victimized and murdered by the English. Young William Wallace wants to go to war against the English with his father, but rather gets left behind and ends up being orphaned. Now we're getting into Act 1A's turning point, or the middle of Act 1, the inciting incident. This is where a new opportunity is put forward towards the protagonist. This is where adult William Wallace witnesses an English noble claim his right to take to bed a young bride on the night of her marriage. The whole prima nocta thing. So he's sort of enticed to take action. Now we're getting into the second half of Act 1, Act 1B. This is where the protagonist rejects the new opportunity and tries to maintain their old way of life. This is where William Wallace is invited to fight against the English, however rejects it, and says, "I came back home to raise crops and God willing a family. If I can live in peace, I will." So you can see he's exercising the vice from the truth premise. He's compromising liberty. The very end of Act 1, or the climax of Act 1, this is where the protagonist is forced to accept the new opportunity. This is where William Wallace's wife is murdered by an English officer. Wallace's goal is clear at this point. He must liberate Scotland from the English. Now we're getting into Act 2. The very beginning of Act 2, or Act 2A, this is where the protagonist tries to make progress towards the new goal, exercising the vice, but experiences defeat overall. So this is where the Scottish nobles refuse to fully support Wallace. The nobles still want to compromise, and tyranny still reigns over Scotland. Then we're getting into the middle of Act 2, Act 2A's turning point, the choice. This is where a choice is offered to the protagonist, where he accepts the virtue. This is where they change their method towards achieving their goal. So this is where William Wallace is knighted. He makes the choice to take on a leadership role for Scotland. Essentially, at this point, he starts to effectively exercise liberty, which is the virtue from the truth premise. Now we're getting on to the second half of Act 2, Act 2B. This is where the protagonist makes progress towards the goal using the virtue from the truth premise, however, still experiences setbacks. Wallace successfully starts to fight off the English at this point. However, with regards to the setbacks, some of the Scottish still want to compromise with the English. And then finally we have the climax of Act 2, or the end of Act 2. This is where the protagonist confronts a major obstacle and is cornered into the point of no return. This is where Wallace is finally defeated on the battlefield, and the reason for his defeat is because of the betrayal from the Scottish nobles. They ended up compromising with the English and betraying Wallace, leaving him to die on the battlefield. So you you can imagine the character Wallace has been pushed to the point of no return. Now we're getting into Act 3. The beginning of Act 3, this is where the protagonist is experiencing a lot of danger. So Wallace is taking out more nobles. He also gets himself into a little bit of a hairy situation by impregnating the newlywed English princess. That's scandalous. So the price on Wallace's head is huge at this point. A lot of people want him dead. And then finally, midway through Act 3, or the final incident, this is where the protagonist must face their demise willingly for the sake of the goal. So at this point, the Scottish are conspiring for the capture of Wallace, and Wallace does have his suspicions, however, continues to fight on regardless. And for the second half of Act 3, this is where the protagonist fights with everything that they got. So at this point, Wallace is captured and tortured, and regardless of what the English do to him, at no point does he give in. He fights like a warrior poet. They actually say it in the movie. It's very beautiful. And finally, we have the end of Act 3, the final climax of the entire film. This is where the protagonist will either achieve their goal or not achieve their goal. And of course, the antagonist will experience the opposite. So Wallace, in his dying moments, yells freedom. And at the same time, the English king dies. Wallace's bloodline lives on through the pregnant English princess, soon to be queen. So metaphorically, you can see that he has achieved his goal. He has defeated the English. And then finally, at the very, very end of the film, the denouement, after all the acts, the untying, this is where the audience is told the truth premise. We see a field of Scotsmen, inspired by William Wallace, charge the fields against the English and finally win their freedom. Dying for liberty leads to freedom. And that's the 3-act structure. Outlining your personal work with the 3-act structure has many benefits. When you're just starting out, it'll prevent writer's block. Also, it'll give your story good pacing and flow. And most importantly, if you do this, all the plot points of your film are structured. So you're free to use your intuition. You are free to express yourself artistically any way you like. I was against it initially myself just because I found it very binding and I kind of hate rules. I'm not big into that. But the way I see it, it's like a page in a coloring book. You are free to use any colors you want. You are free to color outside or inside or through the lines, whatever you want, but it's a good foundation to have to work your way from. I hope you found this video informative. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you all later.